Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be joining us today. I'm Emily Gilpin. I'm the Managing Director of the First Nations Forward Series. Usually we've been using this platform to invite Indigenous leaders and politicians and knowledge keepers onto the site to discuss, different projects and ideas. But in light of everything that's going on, we've taken a pause this week, and we're very grateful to be here today with Sharmarke. And could you please introduce yourself for everybody? Let us know who you are, where you're joining us from.
My name is Sharmarke Dubow, and I'm joining from Victoria, the Algonquin speaking people. And yeah, I'm very happy to join you today and have a good conversation.
Thank you so much. We have lots to talk about. I have a list here of questions for you, but for those who don't know you, do you mind just, I know that you've probably shared your story quite a bit, whatever feels right for you today, do you mind just giving people a little bit of an explanation of, how you made your way over to Lekwungen territories, of, the territories of Lekwungen speaking people, where you grew up and that sort of thing? Just tell us a little bit about you and your life.
Yeah, thank you very much. As I said earlier, I'm based in City of Victoria, and City of Victoria is located the homeland of the Songhees and Esquimalt people. And I arrived on these lands. Actually, this week is my anniversary of 8 years. And I was born in Somalia, the coastline of Indian Ocean, and particularly southern Somalia. And there are certain things that we choose in life and certain things we don't choose. For instance, this crisis, this pandemic health crisis, for me, it was very familiar. And one of the reasons is that when I was 8 years old, and I had to flee from my country because of the conflict at that time in Somalia. There was a civil war. And because of that, it really forced me to move away all the things that were very familiar as a child, like the elders around you, the families, the uncles, relatives. So basically, as a children, we were raised not only my mother, but everyone else, even in the neighborhood. So just being moved away from that, and then going to Kenya, and Kenya is the another country in East Africa, but at the border. So a lot of Somalis at that time either went through the land or through the sea. So I was one of those who really took on the open oceans at the Indian Ocean. And at that time, we were called the boat people because there was so much of influx of Somalis. So yeah, that actually began my life journey as 8 years old. Then it took about 20 years and living in a refugee camp, and then moving to other countries such as Ethiopia, then Egypt, then after 20 years I end up here. And that's why earlier when I say I'm very familiar with how the community feeling right now, and uncertainty and the distress and not knowing what will happen next, So the refugees and people who have been displaced could teach us a lot, could teach us patience, could teach us how to be comfortable when you have nothing in control. It could teach us to really rebuild, and reconstruct your life and begin all over again. And now everybody's talking about the new norm, but for refugees and migrants and people who has been displaced, every time they have new norm when they move to new country.
Thank you for sharing that. That's something that I think I've overlooked. It's something I haven't thought about so much, you know, just saying that refugees and people who have been displaced can teach us a lot. You know, that this time of uncertainty, this time of starting again, questioning everything you thought you knew, adapting, you know, shape-shifting. I feel, you know, that there's a lot we can learn. What are, you know, before moving the conversation forward, what are some of those lessons? You know, what are some of those things that you feel like people could think about or could really just consider in this time, whether they're values, whether they're techniques? What are some of those lessons in your experience?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. That is a good question, and it reminded me, you know, there's a prison near where I live in on the island, and I sometimes visit there, and you are allowed to go in certain times. And I was talking to brothers from different ethnic groups, and we're having conversations, and one of them particularly, we had like an hour conversation. So he was telling me how he is able to see the ocean and other things, but he can't leave, and saying that, you know, I'm here for so many years, but I could hear the birds, I could hear everything, but I can't leave, you know, and I only have my brain, my mind, my body, and I could either imprison myself or free myself being inside there, although I'm limited what my movements are. Then I shared, because it really spoke to me. I was like, when I was in a refugee camp, and it was similar, because you restricted movement. You're in a camp, and that means that there are wires, and you live in zones. And if you want to leave, then you have to ask the government permit to leave. And of course, different refugee camps have different rules and restrictions, and depending which government and which country you are. So to me, it took me that memories when I was a child and teenager, and I was sharing with him how waking up early in the morning and not being able to go to school because there was no that infrastructure, and lining up for the water, and, you know, having all the time and not knowing what to do with that time, right? And just creating your energy, playing soccer and things like that. So why I share that is because you live of hope. You know that things will change. You know that you would leave from this camp at some point. And we know that sometimes folks stay there 20 years and 2 decades, 3 generations. But what really helps people look forward to the next morning and helps them to feel comfortable with uncertainty is that hope. And if we lose that hope, and if we take away that hope from people, then we have nothing to look forward tomorrow. As the brother that I was talking in the prison, he had hope that he's going to leave, and he was looking forward to what his future outside would be. But the challenge was, if that brother leaves, then first everything has changed. Everything that brother knew would be all new. Things have changed, right? So the question is, how do you adapt, and how would the community help you integrate, and how would you let go things you already know and adapt new things, and face that new challenge? And that's where refugees, when they come to new countries and begin their lives, then they start all over again and let go everything they knew in terms of know-how, but then what helps them is their way of life, their culture, you know, and things like that. And sometimes where we get wrong is that we want people to automatically integrate and not see all the things they have. They have language, culture, way of dance. You know, in refugee camps, there's even weddings, right? Birthdays and things like that. People really forget that, and people bring all that. So I think because of that resilience, and that's where I relate a lot to the indigenous communities, because we and people of Black people, we have that resilience, right? So that resilience really kept us going, and that's very crucial. And you can't learn that from the books. Life have to teach you, and the struggle.
Right. And I mean, so talking about resilience and hope, are those things, do you feel hope right now, seeing mass riots across the US, you know, following the murder and assassination of George Floyd, seeing solidarity movements across the world? Do you feel hopeful when you see these things? Do you feel hopeful when you see people breaking corporate buildings in gentrified neighborhoods and, you know, lighting police cars on fire? Do you feel a sense of hope? Because this isn't the first time that you've witnessed or participated in revolutionary movements, and maybe you can share a little bit about your experience in other revolutionary settings and what you think about that.
True. True is, I sometimes, you know, when I walk on the streets of Victoria, sometimes it feels dream, you know, like knowing where I come from. I think I left Somalia because the civil war, before the civil war, it was some type of revolution, right? And the dictatorship, and people felt oppressed, and they felt that resources weren't shared. And it always begins by not sharing the resources, right? People feeling like they have no access to opportunities. Only few people have access to opportunities. And that uprising and people revolting brings, because no one wakes up early in the morning and says, I want a revolution. Because people are oppressed, and they really want to have equal access to everybody else, right? And treated everyone else. So in Somalia, that's what happened, and that's how the war began. But when I was living in the refugee camp, the strange thing is that the camp it was expanding because people were coming, right? Influx of refugees. But what the government of Kenya didn't thought about it is, because it was in the coastline of Mombasa, there was huge prison complex near the camp. So the more it expanded, then the more it get close to, in the morning, you know, the prisoners, they will be out to farm, and that is part of the punishment in prison complex, right? Subtype of slavery, which I don't want to go in. So someone set fire at the refugee camps, and when I say refugee, the houses are made of bamboo and trees. It's not like this type of houses, right? The bed is sticks on the ground, you know. That was the first uprising to me, because I was 9 years old. You know, the refugees standing up themselves, and then their houses being burned, and then they rebuild again. So to me, that was the first. Then, because of that ongoing of tension between the locals, the refugees, and the prison, and that tension, the Kenyan government decided to close the camp in 1996 at the beginning. Then I had to move to Ethiopia. Then that's where I started my school. Life was normal. I wasn't in refugee camp. I was in an urban context, but undocumented, you know. And when we talk about people who haven't passport and whatnot. Then there was uprising in Ethiopia 2000. The students revolted because they felt like they were oppressed and at that time, and really they wanted to have equal chance, equal opportunity. And then for me, it was all over recall of what happened in my country, what happened in the camp. And that's how I decided in 2011, before 9/11, and the world has changed. As a who is a Muslim and black, after 9/11, the world has shifted, right? So I entered Egypt in 2011, before 9/11, and that's where I again became refugee, then started my high school, then finished the university. Then I thought, although I didn't have a lot of access to citizenship or other things, but life was okay because I was able to pay my own school with the help of. Then 2011, while I was working as a human rights, helping migrants and refugees and doing important work on the ground, which was very hard because remember, these governments don't invest a lot when it comes to migrants because a lot of their communities also impoverished. So people who come from other countries who seeking safety haven and coming from conflicts wouldn't have a lot of national programs such as health, education, and whatnot. So non-profit organizations and other humanitarian and aid helps those people, and that's the work I was doing
in Egypt.
Yes. Then the uprising, right? Then I witnessed because at that time Egypt was a police state, and then I don't know how to describe. Everything unfolds so fast, and I'm refugee there, working with refugees. I remember all the international staff evacuated, and from Canadian to Australian, Swedish, and anyone who, and passport is also another apartheid 21st century, which I don't want to go in. Another discussion we may have. So as a refugee, you don't have documents, you have no country that would evacuate you, and uncertainty. So I remember at that time I used to do a theater play outside of my work as a hobby, but as a oppressive theater. So the play used to say, "Oh, freedom, Hurriya, freedom," and things like that. Whenever we do, and the play was to really increase empathy among Egyptians so that the tension would decrease between refugees and Egyptians. And the play was about what does it look like to run from your conflict, fighting for freedom, and your government wanted to persecute you. Now you seek an asylum. So it didn't click a lot. But after the revolution, we were doing the same theater play. People really related to it. They witnessed what it means insecurity, what it means uprising, and it really related to that. So seeing the Egyptian and Arab Spring, to me, that was the most exciting, the most scariest. I remember the police were taking off their clothes, and every street, the neighborhoods, neighborhood watch, because every community, there was such community building and things like that. And it was.
Why were the police taking off their clothes?
Oh, so to go back to that, because remember it was a police state, so there was a lot of police brutality, and people really took over the streets and things like that. So it was safer to look like civilian than wearing police. So police were even afraid because people took over the Tahrir Square and all the streets, and although the military came and trying to rescue the revolution, which is another debate on that. But the reason why the police took over is because people were really, and I don't know how many people watch now, or if they watched the Arab Spring. A lot of people died because there was confrontation between the police riots and the public. And it was ongoing for so many days, right? And that's why the police in certain areas and the public overran the police, and they were going knocking houses and helping them to change the clothes so that they can mingle with the public and feel safe. They can watch the videos and read more. I cannot speak on behalf of the revolution, but for me, someone who had no, and it wasn't my country, I didn't have papers. You can imagine living such an environment and being a refugee or a migrant or undocumented. And the United Nations Higher Commission is invited by the government. So it's not a government, so they can't do much for you, right? And being able for me to walk on those streets to check in the most vulnerable, the mothers and the children of refugees and migrants, it was an easy job. I live with my colleagues in the morning, not knowing what will happen to me if I go back home or if I'm arrested. And if I'm arrested, then I have no country that would speak for me. I have nobody would really, because Egyptians were also being arrested at that time. A lot of people, a lot of youth were being detained. So seeing that and living that type of uncertainty and all that, to me, seeing all this pandemic and health pandemic is very familiar. It's all over again for me to this uncertainty.
So then you make your way to Victoria, so-called Victoria, and you become a counselor, right? And now you're living in this chapter of your life. And, you know, Victoria is a very white city, for lack of a better word, right? The demographic is not as diverse as other cities, as other places. What might you say, you know, maybe share a little bit of your experience making that journey and becoming a counselor? And then I really want to ask the question, what might you say to someone that says racism doesn't exist in Canada?
Okay, I would come back for that question. First, I never thought I would be in a city hall. Now I am in my office. I never thought I will meet you, Emily, and always nice to work with you. I've never thought that I would become Canadian or have this safety and benefit this system, right? And it comes with own privilege. But before I go to my story as someone who's been displaced, I just want to acknowledge that I had no idea the history of Canada when it comes to Indigenous communities. And that is something that I try to, when I was working with refugees at national level, because I've been here 8 years, is to really help to be part of the national discussion. What does it look like before we bring people? Because we come to Canada in so many ways, right? And either the government brings you, or the public sponsors you, or you come as a tourist, or you might come as asylum seeker, or so many ways, international, so many ways come. People surprised when they come and find the history, right? Because especially for the refugees, they come for the Canadian dream, but then they see that in their own new home, adopted home, there has been injustice and ongoing the history and the realities of our brothers and sisters and the indigenous community. I didn't know anything, and the orientation we had overseas before we come barely mentioned about indigenous communities. And I remember I came through Toronto Airport, then Winnipeg, and in the morning, and it was 1st of June, I remember going to downtown and my cousin showing me around. Then it was visible. I could see some indigenous people. I was a bit, you know, I like to observe. So I was surprised. They don't look so white, you know. I can see they have their distinct, you know, like ethnicity, and so I start to question, right? I ask it, who, you know, are they? Honestly, I didn't know if they were from South America or, you know, because I didn't know the history. Although I forgot, I used to watch Hollywood movies, which is the stereotypical, right? And I was surprised there was other guy who was with us and at the coffee. The newcomers pick up the stereotypes, right? Oh, these are indigenous people. I don't want to repeat the words, right? And that was, for me, if I didn't question and Google it, I could have picked up those stereotypes and repeated and sprayed, right? So, but now there's a lot of work happening in Winnipeg, and some of my friends that I know is doing bridge building and between indigenous and newcomers. So, because I didn't have no idea, and the indigenous people didn't know much about the injustices and the colonial that happened, but it's also happening in Africa. So I questioned. Then I had to leave Winnipeg because I wanted to do road trip in the prairies. Then I went to Prince Albert, Regina, Saskatoon. I kept seeing indigenous youth, you know, and inviting me to parties and calling me brother, you know. So for me, I'm not Afro-American, right? I just came from Africa. So although I relate to the culture and all that, so I start to think a lot, you know, I question a lot. What's going on? You know, why some people struggling, you know, in this first world country, you know, why am I seeing this? You know, something wasn't right, you know. So I kept traveling in my road trip, and that is when I started to question. And now that I'm in a power and so-called, you know, local government, and I can make decisions, I want to share a quote that by a Senator Murray Sinclair, indigenous, who I really hold so much respect and love, and I always learn. So he was talking to newcomers and saying, what role do you play when you come to this land, right? And what role do you play in the dialogue of reconciliation? So I love something he said while he was talking to, I think he was talking to newcomers. He said, you might not have the responsibility for the past, but you have responsibility for the future, because you made a commitment to this country, and the responsibility for the future is reconciliation. So that means that you still have to understand what this history is. You have to understand what it has done to this country. You have to understand what it's doing to this country. You have to understand what it will continue to do unless we change. And the leadership from those newcomers community, and he's talking also to me, right? that are occupying more and more leadership positions in government also need to figure out where they fit to this dialogue around change for the future. Because they do fit, they're going to be influential leaders of this country. So for me, being in Canadian, it's a mixed feeling, right? I want to be, I'm grateful to have safety on that. Also, I want to learn the history that took place. So for me, the future and the best I could be is playing a role in reconciliation, because which is the future. And my liberation is really linked to the liberation of indigenous people. And that's why language is really important, and how we approach issues. And that's why there's a lot of work happening and educating newcomers about reconciliation. The ELL, English Learning Program, certain centers, they have the vocabulary and the words and the class plan, and with indigenous terminology, words. So by the time you finish English, you will learn a lot about it. So there's a lot of good work happening, and because the injustice, we relate to that, and we are displaced, rifted away from our homeland. We've lost everything we know. And so to that, and we build solidarity, and we relate to that, because I'm learning a lot every day. I build relationships. I facilitated dialogue between newcomers and reconciliation with others here on the island, so that the public at large also to be part of this discussion. So I learned from you. So
I'm wondering when just before COVID, when a group of led by Indigenous youth, empowered Indigenous youth and supporters and allies took over the legislature building in Victoria, did you have any kind of emotion or sensation that you understood the message? And then there was blockades, there was solidarity movements across Canada shutting down the railway. Like, did you understand that in a way that perhaps other politicians, settler politicians, white politicians might not have quite understood? Do you understand when Indigenous peoples were saying, we have laws too, we have governing systems too, that predate, that are valid, that are sophisticated, that are functioning and alive? And when they shut down Canada's governing system to a point, and then you're there inside, but then having so many ties, you're talking about understanding and having so many connections. So I wonder, what was that experience like for you to witness and be right there in the middle of it?
I didn't hesitate. I went to the legislature, stood up with the Indigenous youth, and I'm so grateful to learn from them and to see such a powerful movement in February, right? And it was so beautiful. It was led predominantly by Indigenous youth, and at the legislature. To me, as I was very clear, to the media and everyone, that I was there as an elected official and also as on a citizen, right, to stand in solidarity. And I felt the energy and the commitment, and I learned a lot from this youth, who really used the opportunity to teach all of us what it means to support and what support should look like. And it went from international community building, right? And it was, I don't even know how to explain it. It was just so beautiful. And to me, I just went there to listen and to support, but they offered me, which was such an honor, to say a few words, and to me that was just beautiful. And it's really important, when when we talk about climate crisis, when we talk about the movements happening, we have to center it in indigenous indigenous teaching, because if we really fundamentally want to rebuild society, which is more just and equitable, then we have to center it in indigenous teaching.
Mm-hmm. On to the next question that I asked. What, now being Canadian, living in Canada, being involved in the political body, what would you say to someone that says, racism doesn't exist in Canada, or Canada is very different than the US? What's happening in the US, the murder of George Floyd, like that wouldn't happen here in Canada. What would you say to that? How would you respond to that?
I think I wrote something on the other day on Facebook and Twitter. People should like that. But to go back to your question, yes, racism and discrimination exists in Canada. It existed before, and it's still ongoing. For instance, I can give you like day-to-day experience. I'm elected official, right? I don't dress your typical politician suit and ties and all that. So, for instance, if I go to the grocery shop, or I'm now in the city, people know me. But if I happen to be in another city and then I go to supermarket, you follow me, and I'm sure a lot of indigenous youth will relate to that. So that itself, already you are labeling me and you put in me. That is like day-to-day. How do you say in English? You could see it, but it's subliminal.
Subtle or covert.
Yeah. Microaggression is all about. Yes. So we see that, right? And there is also systematic racism, and that's why we're seeing what is happening now in the States, what has been happening here. And the question is, how could we really build just and equitable, right? How could we access opportunities? What does it look like, the hiring policies? What does it look like having someone like me in decision making? What does it look like, that I can go through airports, not having random check? What does it look like a woman who wears hijab? And when we look historically, the community has been discriminated from. The city hall is not far from Chinatown, which is the second oldest in North America. The Chinese communities historically, we in our immigration, we had head tax and all that. We don't need to go so far. Now, recently, there's anti-Chinese attitudes, right? But if we go back, we will see similar patterns. The one is we didn't allow Black immigration into Canada. So, and now is a different way, right? And where some cases will delay in Africa, some cases, and immigration was always more European, not the racialized. So we have a lot of history, and it's keep repeating again and again and again. So yeah, and discrimination exists because inequality of intergenerational. We're not talking about inequality that started yesterday, right? Now this crisis that happened, a lot of things are visible. We've seen that how our health system and how the COVID-19 really had impacted people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We are arguing now we should collect data of race, socioeconomic, gender, and see where are the gaps. Then the numbers will speak. We know, you know, I know, you know, but when we have the data, we could say, look, if you want to make a better policies, then this is where the resources should be allocated. If we ask, then how do we know that we have a problem? So we are affording that.
And something that you've mentioned quite a few times throughout this conversation is relationship building. And I think that that's really key. You know, you talked about when you first arrived in Winnipeg and then making your way across from the East Coast to the West Coast and building relationships, you know, meeting Indigenous youth, meeting people, hearing stories. I think that's really crucial because as much as we really, really need education, like education is key, right? What happens sometimes I've noticed is that we educate ourselves or we learn the language, but it's not embodied. It's not an embodied understanding. So there's a lot of allies, for example, who will say the things and post the things, but not feel the things, feel the things that drive them to the streets. And that is happening. There are a lot of people that are feeling, right? But in order to keep the fire burning beyond, you know, in the next weeks and months, but to just really, really push us to a place where we are demanding policy changes, where we are putting people into positions of power and taking other people down, where we're making significant changes, we need to feel the things always.
Yeah, you're right. It's really sad when you look around. That's why I put a lot of work mentoring Indigenous and Black and people of color, young people, and we even I assisted with other folks who had run for an office, you know, and we stayed with them 1 week on a place, and just to really to mentor the Indigenous people, because the challenge is the underrepresentation in politics, but also way too many professional fields. I'm talking about corporate everywhere, right? Really impacts how we see ourselves in the spaces that we exist, we move around and we operate. And when you see folks who look like you, not only look like you, but who knows your way of living, your style of doing decision making, the way you carry yourself. So the uncertainty and the fear have sadly walked toward eroding hope, and some ways that have affected the ways our communities are led and the ways our communities have been designed, right? And exactly, I agree with you. We need racial, we need actual broader racial, social, and systematic change, which is really important if we really want to do a change. And to do that, we really need to build relationships. One of the things I like doing is that something I like to call co-governance, working with people so that if they're working on issue, and then how could we bring as a policy. And as a result, I believe that more than ever today, you know, and I'm sure our ancestors were saying 100 years ago, and that sometimes is I don't want to lose hope, but more than ever today is really important that we really discuss inequalities. Really, like we need to really name discrimination as it is, name the violence as it is, name all the things happening, and not be afraid to name things, and discuss the inequality that exists, and even within the political discourse. And that's why a lot of work at City Hall I was trying to do is bring an equity framework, which was like, how do we make decisions, you know, and make sure that people from all levels of socioeconomic levels deserve the opportunity, you know, to provide input and offer perspective in community building initiatives. so that their voices really strengthen our ability to make inclusive decisions, you know. And that's why I ran, to really, so that decision works for the wider communities. And really, as someone who's in this space, in this position, I have responsibility to really reach out to those voices have been left out, and the entire community, and look at projects that will work for people that have been usually been left out of this conversation, and what does it look like to take just an equitable approach thing to do, you know, if we really want to build healthy and strong communities. Because business as usual would not work if we really be justice. And all my life, from Somalia to Ethiopia to Egypt to Kenya, I've seen people really revolting, and people really fighting to be recognized as to have access to opportunity, recognized to be human. And I want to mention something. So now that that we talk about what does just recovery mean, right? If I share simple things like to access opportunity, it costs financial cost and environmental cost. That means if I drive a car, will have a more cost than if I use transit, right? So, and it's cheaper if I use transit. It's good for the environment if there's electric transit and bikes and walking and all that infrastructure. But transit also helps the most marginalized and low income, and I'm talking about the whole country, right? Not only the island. So if the federal government or if government invest in those green infrastructure and not rescue dying economies such as fossil fuels. And that's where we can learn a lot from the indigenous communities, right? They've been protecting the ecosystem and have been talking about climate crisis and protecting the environment way before these discussions of new Green Deal begin. So that's why we need to go back to our indigenous teaching, but also implementing policy, making sure that we invest and put more investment in indigenous communities, in transit, and things that really help everyday people. And when we get right in equitable and racialized justice, it benefits everyone. When we say indigenous justice and when we say Black Lives Matter, what we saying is, if we get those things right, everyone benefits, you know. And you have to question yourself, if you're not on board for that, are you only comfortable or afraid that you will risk what you have if justice is served? You know, why you don't want to be bored justice will be served? Are you afraid of your lifestyle will change? That's the question we want to ask. So, for instance, at a local government, one of the challenge and frustration I have is sometimes the language we use, trade-off. Oh, we have to do this, we can't do that because we have this dollar of figure, right? So we need to really change how we operate and how we talk about human beings and how we really want to do justice and really, really serve the most vulnerable, the most in need, and that then everybody wins, because we can't pull through this health epidemic and if we don't pull all together. And our communities, the Black community, indigenous community, we had crisis way before this health crisis came. And the crisis came through generational inequality and generational injustice. It's not something we've chosen. It just happened to us because of the colonial systems.
I want to give you, I have one last question for you, and then I want to give you time to share anything else that you might have on your mind and heart. But something that's coming up for me as we're talking, and you have such valuable experience and knowledge and advice, so I'm so grateful for you to be sharing that. But there's a famous quote that is often tossed around. We can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, sort of thing. Audre Lorde. I'm not sure if you've heard of that quote before. Audre Lorde, she's a feminist, activist, writer, born in the 1930s, died in 1996 or so. 1996 being the same year that the last residential school was closed in Canada, something that we often forget. 1996. But you know, this idea that we can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So you're in many ways, a colonial house, right? You're in the legislature building, you're in that operating force, and you're making changes within. And I think, you know, I wrote in an op-ed published yesterday, like, you know, people who are saying violence isn't the answer. You know, people shouldn't be looting and they shouldn't be burning and they shouldn't be taken to the streets. And it's like, well, how do you question fire for blowing up when it has alcohol in its face? Like, really, as much as we want to say this is the right option and this is the right option, and as much as we do want to be reflective beings, we want to be strategic and organized in our social cohesion, like any species must do to survive and evolve. At the same time, people are resisting and they're fighting to live and fighting to breathe in whatever way that's possible, right? So being someone who's doing what you're doing, having your entire life story, and you shared a breath of that with us today, and now you're using the tools that you have, do you think that do you have hope? Do you feel like from the space that you occupy and the work that you're doing, that change is possible, even using some of the master's tools within the master's house? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I can only, all this conversation we were having, which I'm so grateful, I was only speaking of my truth. I'm speaking of what I know, which I continue to transform, I continue to learn. And I'm grateful those who taught me and all the elders I learned from and all my experience. So I'm not talking to you from place of academia, because although I finished computer science, I'm not speaking from you a place like I know all. I ran for an office because I really wanted to give not only hope for the young generation so that they could see themselves, right? I became the second Black city councilor in Victoria after 153 years.
Wow.
So that itself speaks for it, right? So in this system, which has been, I think, close to 2 years now, I had to really learn how the machine operates. And I'm still learning how the machine operates, one. Then how could I bring my teachings, my way of doing, my way of know-how? So one of the ways I use, and to be able, because I was community organizer, right? I was activist. I used to push government from federal to others. You would have seen me on the street before. And now even as elected, I go and join folks who are pushing for change. How I make my decisions is that, which helps me never to hesitate, is human rights lenses. And to me, that is a very crucial, because when we approach an issue from human rights perspective, it really reminds us that each and every one of us is worthy of our consideration and care. Because this is a very helpful reminder in a world where majority rules, right? Majority rules, that means it might serve certain population and whatnot. So this majority rule is often the dominant mentality and way of operating, which I struggle a lot, and as I learn. And as we have seen in numerous situations, right? Once we starting actually to justify actions that disregard one person's or community's worth, we exacerbate and increase the risks and create additional rifts in our social fabric. So when approaching an issue from a human rights perspective, also provided us insight to practical strategies for engaging in through decision-making process that enable more holistic decisions. So as a human rights approach remind us that those who are the most impacted particular decision or set of decisions hold valuable insights. So that's why we need to talk to people who are impacted, work with them, hear their stories, and reflect their stories in decision making. And that can provide crucial information that if leadership, whoever decides, all levels of government, take it serious, then it will strengthen the relevance and the resilience of the decision making. So for me, of course, it's a hard job, right? So when I make decisions, I go through those lenses, and then I go through my experience, my teachings, and my educational and practical, and my relationships that I and organizes. So that is what I do. Sometimes it doesn't go far. Do I get frustrated all the time? Do I have wins? Yes. For instance, when we have Progressive Council, and I'm so grateful that I work with my colleagues. One of the initiatives is youth transit passports. So all the youth will benefit having that, right? So those small things. But I would love to see change at the federal level where the government recognizes the the nations to govern themselves, investing in health, investing in education, investing in transit, making all those programs national so that our basic needs is met. And that's why I am in this fight, and it's a lot of sacrifice, and the fight shouldn't be one way. It should be, individual, structural, institutional, organizational. Tactics must be from different ways and different ways of hitting the system, right? And that's why I want to play my role, but working with you and other folks on the ground, so we all serve purpose, and some of us has to be there, and sometimes, yes, the system could compromise you.
Powerful. Thank you. So all of your work is centered around a human rights perspective.
Absolutely.
We have a question here. I mean, I know that you might have to go, so I'm mindful of time, but one kind of a loose question, your views on First Nations and UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Absolutely. No, is like, period. Government should implement, and not a declaration, right? Really, like, we need to take actions, and I 100% support, and I'm on board with that. But we need to take those actions.
Absolutely. Are there any other thoughts that you want to share as we come to a close now? Anything else on your heart or mind that you want to share in light of everything going on?
I am so grateful, and I'm so happy that first to see you that you're doing well, and you doing all the work, and whoever joined us, who I might not see them, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being with us in this conversation. And I'm just grateful, and I continue to learn, and I continue to transform, and this is this long fight to fight for everyday people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. I'm glad that you're doing well as well. And, you know, we'll be keeping posted with what you have to share. I guess the last thing I did want to ask you about how yesterday you organized a Zoom meeting yesterday. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What were some of the main messages to take away from that?
The one I organized a Zoom with my good friend Boma, to bring all the Black community on Vancouver Island to really have space to share and to check in. How is everyone doing? You know, and how did the COVID-19 impacted you? But what do you want? So it was really beautiful. It was amazing. Then we had attack. People attacked the Zoom and wrote, yeah, they attacked, and we had to close the chat box because they were writing nigger and maybe it was internet those what do you call trolls. I don't know if they were human, and so yeah, they really attacked and wrote so many horrible things. And that really impacted some of the youth that were in the group. And people reading that, it was the most horrific and scary things. But that did not stop us. Because of the resilience, we continue our discussion. So my heart was full because, you know, sometimes you feel you are alone, but when you share, you say, oh, that's not in my head. I too feel that way. You know, and that's why sometimes when I feel talking to indigenous or other folks who feel left out, and we relate a lot. You know, so it was just to create that space, and we talk about what actions we will take. We talked about what does health look like, food security, and other things, but it was powerful. Then there will be a couple of sessions, and the youth will organize every month, every Monday, for them to check in. For me, to roll the ball and bring all the leaders and start that conversation.
I didn't know that. I didn't, you know, that's the first time that I'm hearing that happened yesterday. So thanks for sharing that. But then, of course, you know, talking about the strength and resiliency. And I think it is so important, not only with COVID still being a reality, but everything that's happening right now in the world and has been happening, right? It's just a little bit more televised or visible. And we're perhaps paying more attention because we're restricted in mobility to a certain extent. But one of the big messages is to not be isolated, you know, to keep building those relationships and taking care of yourself and reaching out and connecting. So thanks for sharing that. And it's so good to see you and talk to you, and let's keep in touch and jump on one of these interviews again and keep getting yourself in and out of trouble.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Thank you.